Why does Moshe Rabbeinu count the Jewish people? Well, it might depend on the circumstances, as Rashi illustrates to us in the story of the Magefa after Pinchas. And when the Magefa ends, then Moshe Rabbeinu has to count the Yidden. Why does he have to count the Yidden? Well, Rashi says it's like a shepherd who wants to count his flock after they'd been attacked by wolves. We're going to have a few questions about that. Surely it is the owner of the sheep, Hashem, who wants to know how many people there are. Surely Rashi's already told us before that there are various occasions, whenever anything major changes in the community, then they have to count the Jews. And surely Rashi should be consistent, because previously he spoke about the idea of counting how many there are after an epidemic. And here he's talking about wolves. What's the connection? What's the difference? If the word from Pasuk Vayehi Acharei Magefa, in the Pasuk it says that after the Magefa, then Moshe Rabbeinu is going to count the Yidden. Rashi says, is Rashi Mosif V'goimer. So Rashi uses that phrase as his headline, and then he adds etc. So the etc. obviously alludes to something, right? Was is Merames Iftem, was is kommt bald noch dem. He's alluding to what follows next. Der Tzivoi zu zählen Eden. The instruction to count the Jewish people. That the Eibishter tells Moshe Rabbeinu to count how many Yidden there are, and then on his Mefaresh, Rashi explains. It's a mashal of a shepherd whose flock was attacked by wolves, and a bunch of the sheep are killed, and so now the shepherd needs to calculate how many sheep are left. So lendig bepashtus, und wie es ist Teichem Meforshe Rashi, at face value, as many of the commentaries point out, will der mit Rashi bavoren, and Rashi wants to address von dem Loshen, wie der Pasuk is madgish, vayehi acharei ha-magefa goyme, the fact that the Pasuk says that it happened after the Magefa, is move on, that implies, as der mit wird gemeint, nicht nur zu der Zählen, as der Minyan is vorgekommen noch der friedliche Geschenisch Magefa, that obviously what Rashi wants us to know is not just the chronology. There was a Magefa, now there's a census, but rather to link them. Nor euch as der Minyan is given in Zusammenhang mit der Magefa. That the Torah is obviously telling us that the census is somehow linked to the Magefa. Stellt sich der Scheile, in was versteht die Scheiche zwischen der Magefa und Minyan Bnei Yisrael? So the question immediately arises, so what is that connection? What is the connection between the census and the Magefa? The Torah is clearly linking the two, so what is the connection? It says Rashi Masbir durch den Moshel Araya Chulei v'Humoynos and Leda Minyan Soris. So Rashi explains what the connection is. Because people have died, the responsibility of the shepherd is now to see how many people have survived. Therefore, the census follows the Magefa. Okay, that's the simplest understanding. Except that really, we know this already, don't we? We know that the Eibishter counts Yidden regularly because he loves the Yidden. So why do you have to specify in this particular case? It says, aber schwer as they learn, and it's really difficult to assume that Rashi's whole explanation over here is to try and tell us that it's because there was a Magefa, and that's why they have to count. Because the child, the student, is learning Chumash, it's not the first time that he's heard that the Yidden are counted, it's not a surprise. Rashi already said at the beginning of Bamidbar, this Sefer, because of how much Hashem cherishes the Yidden, he constantly counts us. Was kol shah meant, zu jeder Zeit, wenn es geworden a Shinui in Matzav Bnei Yisrael. What does it mean all the time he's counting us? Whenever there's some substantial change in the circumstances of the Yidden, Hashem counts us. Wie Rashi is dort mamshech. Rashi says it, he spells it out in the beginning of Bamidbar. The examples, when they left Mitzrayim, they were counted. When people died at the time of the Egel, very similar to our scenario, they were counted. When he was going to establish the Mishkan and put his Shechina in the Mishkan, he counted the Yidden. So, versteht schon der Talmud euch benidei dann, as das, was der Eibishter geheißen zählen die Yidden nach dem Magefa, so the child will already know, based on what he's previously learned, that the fact that now Moshe is instructed to count the Jewish people after the Magefa is there's a mitoich hibasen lefanav, because the Eibishter loves us. Punkt wie och shenafle be'egel minon leida minan anisorim. Exactly like after the egel, where there was a magefa and people died, and he wanted to know how many are left. So why does Rashi have to tell it to us? We know already. Una feeling tim Zeleim as Rashi will sich nicht verlassen, as der Talmud wird gedenken, was gelernt in Parshas Bamidbar. You will say, maybe Rashi feels that it's many Parshias down the line. Maybe the student at this point will no longer remember what he learned in Parshas Bamidbar. Fine. Wollt euch dann gewinnen genug zu demonen, dass dem Talmud durch Sagen bekitzel, leider minen anisoris. So Rashi could have easily just said, okay, why count them? To know how many are left. That's all. Why do you have to give this whole mashal and the sheep and the shepherd and the wolves? Which, by the way, the mashal itself is strange. Why do you need a mashal to understand this? And why the specific mashal? So we have to understand was geht zu dem mashal? How does the mashal help us understand the scenario any better? Now that you know it's like a shepherd, now you know more why we have to count the Yidden. Was Rashi bringt in der Asbara von Nimshal. How does this mashal add to the Nimshal? Vechaera is the Nimshal for sich on the mashal genug klar pashat. Surely, without the mashal, the message is clear. Moshe Rabbeinu deroi Yisrael was hat sich meisen nefesh given fatzei marisa. You're talking about Moshe Rabbeinu, the ultimate faithful shepherd, who gave everything, sacrificed everything for the Yidden. He counted the Yidden to know how many had survived the Magefa, so he knows how many he remains responsible for. So who needs a mashal for this? It's such a clear, straightforward message. And the mashal itself doesn't make sense. Base, the mashal leroye, v'hu moina is and leida minan hanisoros, as the roye is there was will wissen minan hanisoros. Why is the mashal that the shepherd wants to know how many are left? Is the shepherd the one who's concerned how many sheep are left? It's like it doesn't match properly with an imshal. Moshe didn't decide to count the Yidden of his own accord. Hashem instructed him to do so. The Eibishter is not the shepherd in the story. The Eibishter is the owner of the sheep. It wasn't Moshe's initiative. So logically, the mashal doesn't fit. Kämen Einteilchen in Kavonas Animshal as Debishot angesagt Moshe an ihnen was is ihm Moshe given Negeya. Okay, maybe you could squeeze out an answer and say the Eibishter was telling Moshe to do something that Moshe already cared about doing anyway. Kishevi das is Negeya Demroya in Nimshal, in Mashal. And maybe that's why we're comparing her to the shepherd. Es bleibt aber Kasche. That's still difficult. Because Rashi can bring a mashal nit from a reyan or from a balatzoin. Rashi could have found a better suited mashal. A mashal that somehow the owner of the sheep is the one who wants to know what happened to his sheep. Oh, by the way, there is actually precedent for that. Gimel. Nochmer in Tanchuma b'midbar Rabba. Vertake gebracht der mashal nit von a reyan, no mashal is the eiv shenafal alatzoin hut sich balatzoin im neusen chulei. Both the Medrash Tanchuma and the Medrash Rabbi use the same mashal of wolves attacking sheep. But who does the counting? Dafka, the owner. So now, not only is Rashi apparently using an ill-suited mashal, but he's changing from a primary source. The primary sources spoke about the Baal Atzoin doing the counting, and Rashi changes that and says the Roya is the one. And it goes deeper than that because Rashi himself previously used the mashal of the Baal Atzoin. What makes it even more surprising? Rashi allein bringt in Parshas Tiso. Beim Zählen dienen noch Meise ha'egel mipnei shenichnas bohem magefa. In Parshas Tiso, where Rashi discusses why it is that the Eibishter said that they should count the Yidden after people died in a magefa, following the Egel Azov. What does he say? Moshe letzoin hachaviva al ba'aleha. It is like sheep that were beloved to their owner. Shenofa bodever, and they were affected by an epidemic. When the epidemic ended, after the epidemic, then the owner asked the shepherd to count, see how many sheep are left. So now why is Rashi changing from his own style? Not only is it a departure from logic, not only is it a departure from the Midrash, it's a departure from his own style. And once you look at what Rashi says there, you pick up a few other differences. Hey, noch shinui. Aleph in Pinchas Tisa sagt Rashi Moshe Chulish enough about Dever und da shnichnusu ze'evim l'teich edroi. How come there when he spoke about Jews dying in a magefa, he gave a mashal of a magefa, of Dever, of an epidemic, yet here he's using the mashal of wolves. How do wolves match with a magefa? Beis. In Parshas Tisa is a madgish and Moshe dominion von Chavivus. Lehidia she Chaviva olav, Mashenkin do in Moshel von Reyaveting as ganzen Nittermond. Over there, after the Egel Azov, he highlights the fact that the Eibishter loves his people, like this Baal Hatzain who cherished his sheep. Here, not a word. And lastly, Gimel, and the Midrashim is the Lashon Al Hatzain L'Teich Hatzain. Rashi is Meshane und sagt L'Teich Edroi. Another very subtle difference. The Midrashim speak about how the wolves came against the sheep, and Rashi says they came against the flock. What's the difference? All right, then Rashi gives another possible explanation, another whole different reason why they should be counted. It's the handover. Dennoch is Rashi mamshech davar acher. When the Yidden left Mitzrayim and the Jews were given to Moshe Rabbeinu's custody, they were handed over with numbers. So now, now that Moshe Rabbeinu is about to leave the Yidden and hand them back to the Eibishter, what does he do? Counts them again. Says moving favos Rashi stellt dem Pirsh als davar acher. We understand why this is only a second opinion, or nit als Pirsh Rishon, certainly not the primary opinion. Veikri, weil dem Pirsh is nit mus be die Sheiches von Su'u v'gemer zu vai hi acharei amagefa. Because obviously you don't see a link between counting the Yidden as he's about to relinquish his responsibility, his role as the leader, that does not connect directly to Magefa. Okay, so logically it's only a second explanation. But then that only makes it a question the other way around. Was ist schwer in dem ersten Pirish? Was zu dem bringt dem zweiten Pirish, welchen sie nicht die Schwierigkeit? What about the first explanation left us still wondering? Rashi only brings a second explanation if the first explanation has not done the job satisfactorily. Now, the first explanation seemed a great explanation. There was a Magefa. Moshe Rabbeinu, the Roya, wants to know how many sheep are left. What's wrong with that? That he has to bring a second that doesn't seem to fit so neatly. Second explanation that, although it's logical, doesn't fit the context. So, what we've got to understand then is, we've got to understand the nature of the census. We've got to understand the nature of when it occurred. And most importantly, we have to understand the nature of Moshe Rabbeinu and his responsibilities. So, the bir in them. Rashi is doisen zum Erfolg nicht nur dem Kishut zwischen Vayachrei Magefa und Su'u Gomer. Rashi is not simply showing the flow. There was a Magefa, it ended, now we count. He's telling us more than that. Warum Kanal, das weiß man schon from Pirshashi and Pashas Tisa and Bamidbar, because we've already illustrated that Rashi doesn't have to tell us that, because we already know it. Now, was ist schwer in die Werte, Vayachrei Magefa, v'gomer far sich. There is something in those words, Vayehi acharei amagefa, and it was after the Magefa. Something about that it raises a question for us. What raises a question? What's going to raise a question is we're going to see that after the story of Bilam's failed attempt to curse the Jewish people, he sent the women of Midian to seduce them, and that's what brought about this Magefa. Now, it wasn't only a Magefa. Some people died in the Magefa. Many more people were killed by the Beis Din. So why are we counting how many people survived the Magefa? Why are we not counting how many people survived the far larger series of executions? So let's see that inside. So we see that those who bowed to Baal Peor, which was the direct result of being seduced by the Midianite women, were punished in two ways. Aleph, one way is that Abisha became so-called angry against them and sent a Magefa epidemic. And the amount of people who died in that Magefa was 24,000 people. A lot of people. And then we have an instruction from Moshe Rabbeinu to the Sanhedrin that they should execute people who were found to be guilty. Rashi touched this up. Rashi explains what that every member of the Sanhedrin, every judge, killed 2 people. V'dayoni Yisrael, shmoine riboy shmeine salofim kitisa b'Sanhedrin. They're 88,000 people. 88,000 dayonim, each executed 2 people. That means that amount of people was over 160,000 people. Yes, 24,000 people in a Magefa is a lot, but 160 plus was like 170-something thousand people. What happened? That's why Rashi says, wow, something about the pasuk really doesn't make sense. Was ist der pasuk madgish achrei Magefa, as the meaning is given b'chtei zu wissen, wie viel es seinen gewend in den Nisorim von der Magefa? Why does this pasuk highlight that they had to count how many survivors there were of the Magefa? Denn Cheshman darf doch sein wichtiger zu wissen, der meaning an Nisorim von dem Hirgish Hanoshab. Surely it's much more important to know how many survived the massive execution by the Sanhedrin. But the Mispar Arugim is maybe V7 more as I feel from the Mispar Mesim by Magefa. You had over 7 times more victims. Surely that's what you have to count. So Rashi's not just simply worried about why are you counting after the Magefa. That he knows. He's asking, why does the Torah emphasize that the count is because of the Magefa, rather than saying because of the total amount of deaths? Und so fein von dit mir bringt Rashi Moshe the Rosh nicht nur so eben chule uchedere kamon. That Rashi answers with this mashal, a specific mashal about a royeh, about a shepherd, because a shepherd has certain responsibilities, and dafka, an attack by wolves, because perhaps that would have been preventable, which is a big part of this conversation. Der Chelek in Pinchas zwischen a Baal Atzain, was heißt dem Roye zählen sein Ledemin und Hanisoris, und a Roye, was zählt sie von sich allein für dem Zweck. So, what's the practical difference between when a shepherd counts his sheep because the owner told him to, or when he counted of his own initiative? Wenn der Baal Atzain heißt zählen die Zain, bechdet zu wissen, min Hanisoris. What would motivate the owner to count his sheep? He wants to know how many sheep he has. They're his sheep. He cares about the net worth of his flock. So kommt es als Teizon, ist damit auszudrücken die Chavivos von die Zon. If the owner wants to count, it's because he cares about and he loves his sheep. Like Rashi said after the Egel Azov, that the Eibishter says, count my sheep so that they will know, or people will know how much I cherish them. Das says, what's the focus when the owner counts? The focus is to know how many sheep are still there. Es ist darin kein Afgemeine nicht, zu einem Unglück von die umgekommenen Zähne ist der schuldig oder nicht. How they died? Irrelevant. Is the shepherd responsible for the deaths? Irrelevant. Der Reker ist die Ganzkeit von der Zähne Neusru Bohem. All the owner cares about is how many sheep are left. Dagegen, wenn der Reue zählt die Zähne Leides minen Anisoros, whereas if the shepherd chooses of his own volition to count the sheep to know how many are left, so he's definitely not trying to show how much he cares about the sheep, because he has a responsibility. Mit der Kavon und Tachle sich abgeben mehr mit die Zähne an die Sorge zu verhitten, sehr zweiten Mal von einem ähnlichen Unglückfall. He wants to know what happened so that next time around he can avoid it happening again. Because he has a responsibility. He carries a responsibility. So he's assessing how successful or unsuccessful his responsibility has been, and therefore, what should he do going forward? Und der Rebbe ist moving, als das ist bika scheich, wenn der Reue fühlt sich schuldig in dem, was es haben gefällt sein von Eider. So when would a shepherd initiate the count? Only if he's feeling guilty. Only if he feels that this crisis was preventable and he didn't do his job properly. Aber es hat passiert in Anöfen, was der Reue hat es nicht gekannt bewohnen. But if something happened to the sheep that there's no way the shepherd could have prevented, demult man sich nicht bei ihm zu zählen die Zöin und wissen dem Innen Hanisaris, then he doesn't feel compelled to calculate how many are left, weil in seiner Arbeit als Rei von die Zöin hat gar nicht gefällt, because nothing has gone awry in his responsibilities. So there's a psychology here. The psychology of the owner is, I want to know how many assets I have. The psychology of the shepherd is, I want to know if I'm liable. Und damit ist moving the Shinui, was in dem Moshel von Baal HaTzon in Pashas Tisa sagt Rashi shenofu bo dever, und dort bei Moshel Resh nichnasu ze evem. That's the key to understanding why in Pashas Kisisa Rashi uses a Moshel of dever. Dever is outside of human control, and here it uses a Moshel of wolves, which are preventable if the Roya was doing his job correctly. A Roya kann nicht verhindern seine Zehn von dever. Ohne ist der Rebbe nicht schuldig, wenn nofu bo dever. A shepherd could not prevent an epidemic, and therefore is not liable for an epidemic. Aber kann, aber das ist sein Tafkid, die Zehn von Seven mit am Makel v'chayotze, but he could prevent wolves. That's his job. That's what he's hired for. That is his responsibility, to prevent wolves from attacking. Und ob es passiert, dass nicht nur so Seven im Chule v'horgeben, ist das der Schuld von dem Rei. So if wolves got into the pen and attacked the sheep, he is liable. He did not do his job. Und der Rebbe bei Moshe von Baal HaTzon, was in sein Chvives zu die Zon ist nicht talking Chelek, wie also die Zon seinen umgekommen Kanal. Therefore, when you're using a Moshel to speak about the psychology of the owner, who's not so concerned about what happened as much as by what the result of what happened is, sagt Rashi, enough about Dever. So Rashi says, they were impacted by Dever. Und der Matzav in Pashiv is given mehr Bedugma to Dever, to the Kamon Sivav. As we'll see a little bit later in the Sicha, what happened after the Egel Azav is much more like Dever than like wolves. Maschenke bei Moshe der Reuer Chule sagt nicht nur so Ze'eve im Chule, weil in Azav Fall rirt es on dem Eifen Mile Atafke von dem Reuer. Whereas here, in this scenario, it's very much a story that is similar to a story of wolves, where the Roya could have prevented it. So now we're understanding the key point that Rashi wants to convey. Moshe Rabbeinu is doing an analysis over here of something that perhaps he could have stopped. Now we can explain why it had to say that's when you count the Yidden, because there's something about the Magefa that perhaps Moshe could have done differently. Das, was es haben gefällt in Rachmanetzan durch dem, was die Schäfte soll, haben geharget die Shanoshav. The fact that Yidden were executed by the Sanhedrin. Ist es doch gewinnen an Öfen was, bessen hat sie gemischbert und dann gewinnen Missa. They went through a fair trial, according to Torah law, and they were found objectively to be guilty and needed to be executed. Und wenn Mela hat sich Moshe Rabbeinu nicht gekannt, vielen schuldig in seinem Umkommen, und zu dem zählen die Nesorim. There's no reason for Moshe Rabbeinu to feel guilty. We went through due process. There was an objective court case. The courts ruled. Nothing I could do. There's no way to overturn that. So Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't carry any guilt over that. Anders is obviously Magefa. But why was there Magefa? Why did 24,000 people die? Well, when Moshe Rabbeinu looks at himself very critically, he says, maybe it was my fault. Maybe I didn't react quickly enough. And he didn't. Pinchas was the one who reacted. So, was abstell hat gehat, Sheiches mit Moshe, wie Rashi bringt her up in Seif Pashas Bolok, Rashi tells us that Magefa had a direct correlation, direct connection to Moshe Rabbeinu. Why? Because Niskab to Shifto Shel Shimon Chulei. The whole Shevet Shimon came in front of Moshe Rabbeinu with the story of Zimri and Cosby. They said to him, Moshe Zeh Asur Chulei, is this Cosby permitted to Zimri to marry or not? Says Rashi, halacha. He forgot the halacha at that point. Or more correctly, the halacha was concealed from him. And we'll see in a moment that that's the point. The halacha was concealed from him. Then Pinchas was the one who remembered the halacha, and he took the law into his hands. He killed Zimri, and that's what stopped the Magefa. So Moshe Rabbeinu is introspective, and he thinks to himself. Und agamas das, was in Samen Aloch ist gewesen an ihnen, was ist gekommen, in Meile mit der Kavone, wie Rashi sagt, Pinchas vital Sarah Oiloi. Even though Rashi is absolutely clear that this is not an indictment on Moshe Rabbeinu at all, but the reason Hashem hid the halacha from Moshe at that moment was that Pinchas could come into his own greatness. Is das noch kapeshmaya gale as Moshe is in dem nicht gewesen schuldig. That's the Eibishter's perspective. that Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't carry any responsibility for what happened. Aber Moshe bei sich hat gekonnt trachten, but Moshe in his own personal introspection thought, or could have thought, as das given by Minyan Shel Shicha, not that it was a Gzeira Melamayla, but that he actually forgot the halacha. Was hat versammelt auf a Weile dem Abstell von der Magefa, and that was the direct cause of delaying the end of the Magefa. So Moshe feels personally responsible for how many people died. Fewer people could have died if he knew the halacha just like that. We know that Eibusha held the halacha from him. Moshe Rabbeinu introspects and says, maybe I didn't remember. Und da sagt Rashi, as der Minyan Achrei Magefa is musber durch ein Moshe leroi esh enichnu nusu ze'evim chulav omoinos leida minyan aneisoros. So now we get what Rashi is doing. The problem in this pasuk is, why does it say Vayehi acharei hamagefa? That there's something about the magefa that precipitated the counting. Why is it not the whole amount of people who died? Why specifically the magefa? Says Rashi, I'll tell you why. Because this is a roya counting. This census was precipitated. This was motivated by Moshe Rabbeinu. Why would Moshe Rabbeinu want to do it? Why would a roya ever count? Because he feels he hasn't done his job properly, and that's what's happening here. Number one, Moshe initiated the census, or at least he wanted the census. And the purpose of the census is to know how many survived, not the whole story, but specifically the Magefa. Because Moshe wanted to know the fallout from something that he believed he could have possibly prevented. Wenigstens kleiner machen wollt gewen mehr neusores, because he's comparing himself to the shepherd who could have prevented the wolves coming in, or at least prevented some of the carnage. Mashenke by Maisa Egel and Pashas Tisa, Moshe did not have this guilt at the time of the Egel Azor for a very obvious reason. Was Moshe is dann gewesen bei Har, Moshe when he was on Har Sinai, there was no direct relationship between him and the Egel Azov and anything that he could have done at that moment to prevent it. Dort hot cannot nit as Moshe mit Sadatzmoi, als Reya soll zehn Marisoi. So therefore Moshe has no motivation why he personally should feel the need to count the Yidden after the Chet HaEgel, because he knows that he doesn't carry any guilt over it. The Rebbe brings dort Rashi, that's why in that Rashi, how does Rashi explain the mashal? Firstly, it's the relationship or the attitude of the owner to the sheep. That it's a counting initiated not by the shepherd, because the shepherd doesn't feel jittery, but by the owner of the sheep. Because the kind of Magefa that happened then was similar to an epidemic, meaning something that the shepherd could not have in any way prevented. So why does the Eibishter want the animals to be the sheep to be counted? Why? Because he loves them and he cares about them. So that's the explanation that Rashi gives. It's a beautiful explanation, but it's got a missing piece, which is why he has to also bring a second explanation. What's missing in the first explanation? The Yidden are now on the border of Eretz Yisrael. Great Arains again in Eretz Yisrael. They're about to go into Eretz Yisrael. And Moshe Rabbeinu has already been told, this is it. The end of the line for him. He is no longer going to be the leader of the Jewish people. He's not taking them into the land. It's Moshe going to leave his people. Was der versteht bald nach dem Minyan bnei Yisrael und Parshas bnei Slavchad, was gewem hemschich zu dem Minyan, alei el haru havorim as ever gomer. That's why soon after this we're going to be told Moshe Rabbeinu go to haru havorim and have a look at the land. Und danach hat der Eibishter geheißen Moshe semich sein Yehoshua, and then he's going to be told to appoint Yehoshua as the next leader. Und bald der Minyan von Arayes Kanal gedeiht zu wissen, sein Anhage mit sei Marise auf lehabo, sich abgeben mit sei und verhitten sei weiter von einem Unglück. Because the logic we use to say, why does the shepherd ever feel that he needs to count the sheep? Because if he feels he had lapsed in his duties, he has to know how to do better in the future. Atem doch in ot dem Minyan gedaf mishatem seine Yeshua azev Elazar. Was hat bald gedaf während der Reue Yisrael. Then Yehoshua should have been one of the people involved in the census because he's the next leader. He's the one who has to know how to prevent such a disaster in future. So there is the missing piece of the first beautiful explanation. Even though maybe you could answer, look, the Eibishter knew it's still going to be a few months until Moshe Rabbeinu actually takes leave of the Jewish people. So it is actually relevant for Moshe for the next few months to do the census and know how to prevent another pirza in the future. And if Mary Senor is not glad, but then still to imagine that you're not going to include Yehoshua, who's going to lead the Yidden for years. The Rebbe brings Rashi at Zweiten Pirish, so Rashi has to give a second explanation. Because to try and force this answer and try and say, Moshe's still got a few months on the job, it's just not good enough. If the whole purpose of saying that the shepherd counts is because of the psychology of the shepherd to ensure that he doesn't do the same thing again next time, there's no reason why Yeshua should not be included. Therefore, Rashi brings a second explanation. As the minyan is verbunden mit misas Moshe, and that explanation actually fits logically to say, look, it's because it's Moshe at the end of his duties. That's why he's counting to return them with a census as he received them with a census. Aber der zweite Pirish ist noch schwerer wie der erste, weil ist der Minyan nicht verbunden mit Vayhi achrei Magefer no mit Korev Lamos. As we mentioned right at the beginning, obviously this is a much weaker explanation because it has no direct contact with the words Vayhi achrei Magefer. If anything, it has connection to Moshe passing away. Und der Rebbe bringt das Rashi nur als zweiten Pirish. That's why Rashi only can bring it as the second explanation. Und der erste Pirish is the Pirish Ikrim Pshuto Shel Mikro Chanal Siv Gimel, and the primary explanation remains the first explanation. Therefore, verstehen. There's still a lingering question. Why, in fact, was it Moshe who wanted to count the Yidden over here? Why, in fact, is it not the Eibishter who's driving this census? And why don't you hear from the Eibishter the same theme that you normally hear? They're beloved to me, I care about them, and therefore I want to count them. Und demot wollte es gewinnen, sei die Neusorim von der Magefon, sei die von Hirgish Anosha B'chanal, in which case, by the way, that the census would have related not only to those who died in the Magefa, but to everybody who died during this period. As mein Balatzen is Benegel in Yamin can afgeminen it via Zaytitzen sein umgekommen, because as we mentioned, if you're looking from the perspective of the owner, he's not so fixated on the details of how they died as much as that they died. So why takes are coming from Moshe, not so much from Hashem? It's the bir and them. So the answer is this, and based on this, we're going to actually get a very powerful lesson. The situation was such that the Yidden had interacted and created intimate relationships with non-Jewish women. Was im Pirshrashi Fadim as kanoin pögen bei on ken edes besten und so weiter, versteht schon der Ben Chamish Mikra die äußere gewöhnliche Harbkeit von der Avera. The fact that the Torah makes it clear, and Rashi speaks about it in very clear terms, that this is a scenario where you don't even have to go to Beis Din and you don't even have to have witnesses, but the zealot takes the law into his own hands as Pinchas did and killed them there on the spot. That drives home the message even to a child learning this, that we're dealing with very serious things. A very serious Avera. Bis es hat gebracht zum verloren gehen von Arum 200,000 in. Imagine that this is something that is so serious, it kills 200,000 or more. Like Rashi said right at the beginning of the story when Bilam proposed this to Balak, and Bilam said, the God of the Jews hates promiscuity. So then it's just inappropriate at this point to say that David wants to show how much he loves them. This is not the time. This is not the time to express that love. This is a time where they have rejected that love, and they have acted in a way that causes Hashem's hatred. In fact, you can even look at this from an halachic perspective, and it will add more value. Be'el haramis is a chetvas b'lashon Rambam yeshvei hefsid she'ein b'chol ha'aroyas kamoisa. The Rambam writes that a person who has an intimate relationship with a non-Jewish woman is worse than all the other forbidden relationships in this way. A person who commits incest or adultery, his child is still absolutely his child. And the child is still 100% Jewish. Maybe a mamzer, but 100% Jewish. But if a person has a child with a non-Jewish woman, it's not his child, from a halacha point of view. And with the Ragachava is mazbeach durch dem chetes me ma'abed nefoshes misol al yedei de ozil zarim basra. Like the Ragachava phrases it, we actually destroy the potential Jewish soul because she follows, or the child follows, the mother's religion. Das heißt, by alle andere averas, welches sie sollen sein, any other avera, no matter what, no other avera crosses the boundary that Hashem made between us and the rest of the world. A person does the worst avera and they remain 100% Jewish. Wie bald als the Kind, was hat gedarf sein von der Foshes mi Yisrael, gemacht also Basra, geworden ein Nochri. But when a person sires a child with a non-Jewish woman, takes a person who should have been Jewish, and now pushes that person into the world of the non-Jewish reality, the person who does that avera, everything Hashem does is midah keneged midah. So they've pushed this child away from the Shechina. They get pushed away from Hashem's love. As the Rambam himself says, this is an avera that causes a person to become attached to the non-Jewish world, which they just told us we have to be separate from. Therefore, it's out of the question to suggest that this is a time where Hashem is now going to show His love by wanting to count them. Any person who was not involved in the Savera is not a survivor because it's not in any way related to those people. There's like no connection. Those who died are another faction. They're no longer part of the community. We don't have to count their remainders. So from the Eibishter's point of view as the Baal Hatzoin, no need to count over here. Those are as if they were never my sheep. Whereas from the Roya's point of view, he wants to know, was I not as responsible as I should have been? He wants to count. This story, and specifically the angle that Rashi gives us on it, teaches us two very dramatically different lessons. On the one hand, the story shows us how terrible the Avera of intermarriage is. As der Hesed ist nicht nur was Ozel Zarem Basra, no ich de Cheta allein wird durch dem wie ausgeschlossen von die 10 Marisa Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's a double whammy. Not only is the child disqualified as being Jewish because he follows his mother, the person who was Jewish is now no longer in this chavivus, in this bubble of closeness of Hashem as a Jew should be. Und das ist ein Reif dem Gödel als Schuss, wo Kreis von die, was Jeschbiodem und Machis und abhalten a viel a Jochid und a viel ein Mol von durchfallen durchzufallen in dem Chet. So that you can only begin to imagine the incredible merit of somebody who can prevent this happening even just once. Even one person, once. And that includes people who are already in that situation, the schus of getting them out. So that's on the one hand. It's so devastating in its spiritual repercussions. Yet on the other hand, you see, as when it gets to Versorgung zur Chem Schmiru von Seven V'chuli is Moshe Rabbeinu der Nemesh Kol Yisrael was is sich Moshe Nefesh bei jeden Iden legt sich herein in der Gerach Selch Iden. And at the same time, you see that Moshe Rabbeinu, as the real faithful shepherd of Yidden, runs to look after these Jews too. even to the point of Mesiras Nefesh. That's why he wants to count them, and he wants to show that I still care about them. I want to know how many are left. They are still his flock. As Rashi used the expression. Not only are they on the fringes, they live inside his flock. What more beautiful way could you get for the Rebbe to describe himself? And that becomes a direct lesson to us, that every single one of us has the responsibility. If the Eibishter doesn't want to have the chavivus with that particular person because of how they behaved, that's not me who should do that. My responsibility, toich edroi, they're part of our flock. I have to engage with them, work with them, and hopefully turn them around.